Hi, my name is Brian Van Brunt, and I'm the Executive Director of NABITA and one of the teaching faculty with ATICSA. I'm here with Michelle, and we're going to talk to you for a little bit about trauma-informed processes and how to bring them into both the investigation and the hearing process. Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Certainly, thank you. Hi, my name is Michelle Isidore. I serve as Assistant Executive Director of Prevention and Advocacy for ATICSA and Executive Director of SCOPE, the School and College Organization for Prevention Educators.
This is a challenging topic in a lot of ways because we want to try to make these videos as timeless as possible. One of the challenges we have is there's a really moving needle on the issue of trauma-informed processes. I think it's fair to describe it a bit as a grandfather clock pendulum that on one hand, or we'll be Title IX friendly, or a grandmother's clock. It could go either way, right? So we could see this kind of swinging, I think maybe 10 years ago. People weren't thinking about this at all. We were looking at investigations and conversations that were not trauma-informed in the least. In fact, it was almost the opposite of what we'd like to see, that questions were jumped around, that we started from a position of, is the person really telling the truth? How do we get consistent stories? So a little bit more adversarial, if we could use that word.
Very victim blaming in some ways. It felt like a stacked deck against victims both on campus and in the criminal justice system, I would say.
Yeah. And, if I can swing it back the other way, I think where we are right now, and right now is November 2017 when we're doing the filming, I think there's been some pushback on trauma-informed processes where we see it a little bit more questioning some of the equity of the process. Are we now erring the side of not victim blaming, but really the respondent in this case, is he being treated typically, in maybe more of a heteronormative example, is the respondent being treated in a way that creates some inequity in this process too. So, as we bring this together, I think some of the research has been presented. It's swung, both ways. And when I think, though, about trauma-informed processes, and if I really think we can take it out of make it a little more timeless, it reminds me a little bit of just simply bias, that when we're working with someone, whoever that person is, can we approach the person that we're working with in a way that respects their individuality? And not because I know both Michelle and I are great social justice warriors and good karma people. So let's leave that aside for a minute. Not just to be a good person and a decent human being, but in fact, the thing I like best is to get accurate data. That am I not detecting something that I need to detect? Am I not collecting information accurately because my bias is pushing the person, keeping them quiet, increasing their impression management, their lack of willingness to share with me? Or are the questions I'm asking intentionally shutting that person down or getting them angry and defensive? Yeah.
And I think when I think about trauma-informed processes, I agree, it's sort of outside the scope of the research around neurobiology of trauma specifically, or any question around that research, or any question about issues of due process or fair procedure rights. I think we're really talking about creating a space that is safe to share what happened for both the reporting and responding parties. And that can be everything from the content of the questions, as you said, to the space that we've created in our environment, the way we take notes, the way we ask the content of our questions, and all of that is using the research, but also doing the right thing and helping us get the most accurate information to find the crux of the issue, if you will, to see where the evidence takes us.
Yeah, I'm looking, as we're talking, looking at some of the slides that are up in front of you. One of them is entitled Forming a Safe and Trusting Relationship. That should be, again, talking about this idea of equity and process, that's very useful for someone who has had a trauma experience, who might be hesitant coming in, might be hypervigilant, reactive to a certain person, not responsive to authority, not really having the greatest memory sometimes in terms of fragmentation. However, that's just as useful for really anyone else you're talking to. We all like to be understood and cared about. We like our story to come out. In fact, one of the other programs we did looked at bias and deliberations and groupthink and conformity. And one of the things we talk about in that program is, and the one I did with Scott as well on credibility, was this importance of how do we form a trust and rapport with the other person so they feel safe to share accurate information with us. So really wherever the person's coming from, whether it's trauma, grief, mental health, wherever they're coming from with a potential thing that might get in the way of getting accurate information, a process in this case really just takes that into account so that we're getting more accurate information forward, realizing there's other things that might get in the way that might cloud our filter, if you will, to be able to see things accurately.
And I think one of the things that I've taken away so much from training on trauma-informed processes, whether it's for those doing police investigation work, investigators of civil rights issues on campus, or even in my own work as an advocate, recognizing that that's a very different role, is checking your biases, as you said, and trying to rethink or reframe what you maybe have seen in representations in popular culture of what someone in trauma looks like, how they should behave, how they should react or should respond, and understanding that there can be a continuum and a range. People are different, but that we may hear people remembering things differently. They may have some gaps in their memory. Things may be fuzzy, and they're still working on putting things together, making sure that we're offering frequent breaks for people when we're interviewing them, and doing some intake. Trying not to take things personally, right? So if someone is feeling resistant, if they are feeling hypervigilant, if they are having a reaction to the person interviewing them, it's not about you. You're there to perform the function that you are there assigned to do, and you need to recognize your bias and understand it, and be able to check it at the door to continue to do the good work.
Yeah, it's somewhat a Goldilocks approach, isn't it? Like on one hand, the porridge too hot, porridge too cold. Like for me, the porridge too hot would be ignoring the entire issue of trauma completely, starting from a blank slate, if you will, and just asking questions that the same to everyone that you talk to. And
sure.
Well, there's some niceness in that conformity and consistency. The idea of really matching, the person that you're talking with, whether it's again trauma, culture, mental health, grieving, whatever they're going through. How can you make them more comfortable so they build rapport and feel more comfortable sharing? On the other end of the spectrum, the porridge too cold, if you will, I think is the exact opposite problem. On one hand, we have someone who is trying to not take trauma into account at all. Yeah. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have this person over here who says, well, the issue here with trauma is so important that we don't want to actually even interview you because we don't want to. We had this advocate who said that can be re-traumatizing. So we get like this sometimes well-meaning but badly applied advice that
misinformed potentially.
Indeed,
yeah. No, I agree, and I think that there are those that perhaps misunderstand or misapply research and best practice, and that's why we need to think about what are the pieces that we know about trauma-informed interviewing and trauma-informed processes that always apply, that can, regardless of which way political winds may blow or changing guidance that we may receive, what comes down, this is a best practice, and this is how we can create a strong process. And that means well-trained investigators. That means going through training to understand trauma-informed processes, asking things in different ways, re-asking questions, as we've said, setting up an environment that's conducive to someone feeling as safe as possibly they could if they're experiencing trauma. All kinds of tips and tricks that we have on the slides, and we offer throughout other materials through ATICSA, and there's other wonderful organizations that can speak to trauma-informed processes and interviewing as well, that you want to infuse when you're hiring, when you're training, and make sure you're revisiting, because that best practice will evolve, but there is a common core, if you will.
Yeah. I think that's all very true. When we're moving forward with these discussions, when we're trying to apply these things to scenarios, I think it also requires for us a sense of grace, if I can use that word, that when we are doing these things, we might have really good intentions. So if we're doing an investigation, for example, we sit someone down, we're collecting their story, and in our mind we say, well, how about this? How about we have a conference room, it's private, we have the shades drawn, and this is why we're going to do it here, because it's the most private room that we have, that it's more secluded in the back. We're going to bring them some water. And the unintended piece, Michelle knows where I'm leading with this, is that the person comes in and they're terrified. They're in this like formal conference room. There's a picture of a horse on the wall somewhere. And they're just, it's too much. So I think also just being aware of like the best laid plans, when you are trying to make someone comfortable. The issue of tissue boxes comes up too. Do you have tissues available? Do you offer tissues when someone's crying? You put 10 therapists in a room, half of them say, yeah, that's a very kind thing to do. The other 5 say, well, no, by giving them a box of tissues, you're actually sending this meta message that it's not okay to emote in front of me. So you're like, I didn't think of that, right? Yeah. So the best thing with the tissues, by the way, have them present. Just don't, let them be there, and the person can use them if they like.
Seems to make the most sense.
Right. So, I think this also, again, I know grace might not be a very term that you started thinking about in this program in terms of what an investigator should have, but maybe flexibility as well, a willingness to be wrong, to try a different tact that might work better,
right.
And just a willingness, again, all within the lens of impartiality, that we only can go so far with this. You can't start with, I believe you and I'm so sorry this happened to you, even though as an advocate, or a therapist, that would be where I would start.
Different roles.
It's a different role. So within the lens or the confines of impartiality, can we be supportive to the individual in the same way? And again, this is my parallel, in the same way that we would be supportive from an individual from a different country, a different socioeconomic status, a different ethnicity, different language, different sexual orientation, that all of these things start to become informed processes that we have that impact the rapport that we build with the person we're talking to.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the different roles, of course. I think some of the core things about doing this type of work that people often don't understand, as a prevention educator, people will say, oh, well, I would never send my child to a school where reports were going up, right? Where they were reporting, they felt safe coming forward and reporting sexual violence. And of course, that's the exact opposite message. I would never feel safe sending my child to a school where things were, silenced or kept under the rug. And similarly, I think we will continue to improve upon our trauma-informed processes. We've had featured speakers at the annual TICSA conference speak to this issue, where they talk about thinking about structural and systemic things. Where do you park to get to your office to come in for an interview? Do you have to cross other commonly populated areas where it may not be as anonymous? If that's something that's important to someone, that would be a barrier to reporting. There's a reason that when police officers are conducting interviews, one of the first things they often do is offer someone a cup of coffee or hot water or tea, because there's something very comforting about that. Creating a space that's comfortable, as you said, not sitting so far apart but not so close together, and finding what works given the space you have available, or do you need to find different space on campus? Making sure some people talk about recording versus taking notes, and do you do that pen and paper? Do you do it typing? And so there really is a lot of information out there about best practice to make the process not adversarial as much as you can. Again, recognizing that when we're talking about civil rights investigations, this is meant to be an impartial fact finder, and that there are others, hopefully, on your campus and in your community doing that important counseling and advocacy work, the worlds from which we come, but that you can learn from one another and figure out which pieces can make your process as strong as possible.
Yeah, more often than not, people feel more comfortable sharing information with us in a less guarded way, which is, again, kind of the point with an investigation, when they feel comfortable with us, when there's a sense of rapport and caring. And while we can talk about, again, the karmic good of offering someone a hot beverage, the other thing that it does from a psychological standpoint is it creates a sense of vulnerability, that I've now given something to you, I've been vulnerable, there's an unspoken request that you give something back to me, an accurate story. So while it has this kind of magic trick, kind of these aren't the droids you're looking for, kind of Jedi mind trick feel to it, there's also a benefit to being kind to people, because it does increase rapport and increase their willingness to give you good information that you can build into the report and use as part of your fact pattern. So I think some folks push back on this idea of any, insert buzzword right now, like grief, trauma, mental health informed processes, as unique, special snowflake kind of things that they can't handle, anything, these college students these days. I would push back on that and say any process that shows a sense of civility, good manners, and caring for the other person's perspective is actually going to lead you closer to accurate information, which is always our goal. It just happens to have the side benefit of being a decent human thing to do as well.
I would say too, think about the the institutional history, if you will, of what some offices may have, the reputation, both for this work in general or specifically at your institution. Think about what creating a trauma-informed process can do for the reputation of your office. If people have a positive experience, especially in a time of crisis and potential trauma, that they feel that they were treated with that dignity and respect, that they were treated equitably and fairly, then that means that people are going to be more willing to come forward when they do have something to report, that they are going to trust the process. And I think we're looking at, certainly making each case by case as fair and equitable process as we can for the parties involved, but also creating a climate overall, a community where we have the offices entrusted with doing this work feeling like they are trustworthy and respectful to all parties involved.
Yeah, indeed. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I think it's important to understand some of the things that we're saying and some of the things we're not saying. One is, when we develop this kind of training program, we try to make them timeless. This topic was particularly challenging, I think, for us because the research is in flux in this area and there's really been some political movements one way or the other. When we thought about this, I think the idea of equity, to me is kind of like a closing thought, comes back again with this, that if we have an equitable and fair process for all involved, what that does is it goes back to this discussion of treating everyone where they need to be treated. That in the same way we might create a space that accommodates physical disabilities to make the person more comfortable, that we think about their parking considerations, and that we might not do an interview on like the 5th floor of a walk-up with no elevator for someone who's in a wheelchair. Sure. I think the parallel here is someone who just was spending the night in the hospital, who was traumatized the night before, who's been assaulted, to take into account some of the, when we know some of the work I've done with trauma victims who've been assaulted, this idea of being jittery, being hypervigilant, struggling with, safety, kind of where they are, maybe some hypersensitivity to touch, gender differences here. So, a loud noise, a startle reflex. So I think having an investigator trained in these kind of things, not to downplay the ability of the person they're talking to kind of be contributing and talking and being able to handle themselves, but just creating a more safe, comfortable, and in some ways equitable environment. In the same way with a respondent coming in, if I'm doing the interview, I want to have in the back of my head suicide risk and how this person's feeling potentially, and not always, but potentially shame and embarrassment and fear of retaliation. That these are things that I have in mind, I think, on the other side of this process. If we're talking trauma, it's not just the complainant, but also the respondent. There's some potential trauma to both parties. And when we treat them fairly and equitably, we really get out in front. Final thoughts, Michelle, things that you would bring to kind of tie this stuff together?
I think, as you mentioned, we do want these to be timeless, and we are in changing times as we are filming, but that this work isn't going away, and it is an evolution, and we have come a long way, and we need to acknowledge some successes, course correct where needed, but continue to do good work because we do want to treat all parties with that dignity and respect that they deserve, and that serves the process as well as serves the individuals on our campuses. Absolutely.
I want to thank you for spending some time with us today, talking with Michelle and I about this important issue. If you have questions about this or need additional resources, you certainly can email either of us. Our information's up on the screen there. We're attached to this product. So happy to talk to you more about this, and appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Thank you.